hey, sprint 1 will be milestone A and sprint 2 will be milestone B, and then we'll finish it in sprint 3 or something.
Welcome, everybody, to another episode of Real Agile or BS. We love talking about and answering all of your Agile and Scrum related questions. Today is an interesting one that happens all the time in the world of software development. It's very simple. Is it okay to have items in the backlog carry over to more than one sprint? So obviously, let me give some context. For those of you who've been in a class with Bob or I, or been one of our clients, certainly we've discussed this idea of trying to, during our sprint planning, to do our best to create a package, to create a end deliverable that we believe that we are able to fulfill and deliver with quality at the end of that 2-week, 1 week, whatever set time box cadence that you have. And obviously, if you do not deliver everything that you committed to, then you have a great retrospective. And so this whole idea of creating or putting so much work into a sprint that is going to carry over, well, that's the question today. Is that real Agile or is that BS? Bob, I'll pass it over to you first.
Well, Peter, I think that it's the way that you phrase it, certainly BS. The question becomes, is it bad for that to happen all the time? Yes. Is it bad for it to happen once in a while? The team is stretching themselves a little bit and they miss? Maybe not. Maybe it's okay. And maybe they thought they could get it done and it just spilled over. I tell people in class that the number one reason Scrum teams fail is they're always carrying work from one sprint to the next. And that's a real big problem. If on an occasional basis, and I tell people 1 out of 7, I don't know why I picked 1 out of 7, but it's about 15%. 1 out of 7 sprints, if you're carrying work from one sprint to the next, I'm not going to get overly upset about that because that's a team that's doing pretty well compared to most teams in the world that we deal with. On the other hand, deliberately saying we know we can't finish this in the sprint and we're going to pull it in anyway, probably not a good idea. I think that's probably BS. I think we want to try to get things done within a sprint. That's where we start talking about splitting stories, splitting backlog items, backlog grooming, all those things come into play. And if you're not doing those things well, you probably don't have a real good chance of success anyway. But you don't want half-baked stuff at the end of the sprint because you have nothing to demonstrate. It's half-baked. It's not valuable. On the other hand, it's not too hard to split it into 2 pieces that say, we're going to do this segment that has some value we're going to learn from, and then this segment that finishes it off. That's okay. It's a big item. It's going to take 2 sprints. But we have a valuable deliverable in each sprint. So I think it depends on the context people say with it. If it's an item where we say, oh, this feature is going to take 5 sprints, I don't have a problem with that, as long as we break it into sprintable pieces. On the other hand, if they say this is going to take 2 sprints, there's no way to make it smaller, so we're just going to start this sprint and finish the next sprint. No, absolute BS. There's always a way to split things smaller. You just have to think harder about it.
Absolutely.
How about you, Peter?
I think that right there is probably the keynote of this entire the entire context of this conversation is that we don't want overflowing sprint backlogs to be an excuse or to be leveraged as an excuse to say, oh, well, we didn't have time, couldn't break it down, we're just going to do it anyway. I think that really points to the lack of team discipline around chunking things up, around slicing them well, which, by the way, for everyone out there that's listening and watching, we have an amazing user story splitting cheat sheet that was built by a colleague of ours, Richard Lawrence, that you can find on agileforall.com. So if you are having troubles out there figuring out how to split stuff around features, around data, around process lines, around organizational lines, right? There's lots of different ways to split stories. So make sure that you check out agileforall.com, go into our forums. You can search for user story splitting cheat sheet. You can probably Google it and jump on our page anyway, because it's so well known. So feel free to download that resource if you're having problems with splitting stories into the smallest units possible. And there's many, many ways to do that. Back to this. Again, the whole idea is to break things down into a sizable chunk that you can manage and hopefully deliver within that sprint. But I really want to add some emphasis here, Bob, on the retrospective. I think and you know how valuable the retrospective is that retrospective really is our opportunity to say, hey, we didn't get it perfect. Totally okay, not a big deal. What are we going to do next to reduce that risk? Or what have we learned from our previous experiences here so that we can not have that happen again. You said 1 out of 7. I don't have a number to it. I've never actually thought about creating a ratio, like a golden ratio of success. But for me, the retrospective really is that let's pound the ground. Let's figure out, hey, what happened? How can we make this better? How can we learn from our mistakes? How can we split this better? Do we need to review the way that we were looking at it? Do we need to bring extra people in to help us understand this better? We might need to spike some technology that we don't understand. There's lots of different ways to do it. The thing I don't want to have at the end of the day is that we bring in traditional mindsets of, it's not a big deal. We'll just do it next sprint. Like that crushes me. So at the end of the day, all your work in a sprint should not be carried over. That's BS. And we should create disciplines within the team so that we can learn how to do the work better. Bob, I'll give you the last word.
Yeah, when you said we shouldn't go into it thinking that we're just going to take a couple of sprints and that's okay. I just keep going back to the old world of, hey, sprint 1 will be milestone A and sprint 2 will be milestone B, and then we'll finish it in sprint 3 or something. So it's just the wrong way to do it. And even if you split the stories, that's not the way to do it, right? I mean, you shouldn't say, for example, I've got analysis and design done in sprint 1, and I've got something else done in sprint 2, and we're going to do coding in sprint 3 and testing in sprint 4. It's like, oh my gosh, you just created a waterfall. You just called it sprints. So I think that's the behavior it leads to if we don't do it right, which is split it in small vertical slices. You want to have complete functionality end to end as much as often as you can. They're valuable. The story splitting worksheet that you mentioned does a great job of that. It's available in a ton of different languages. I think we might actually redirect to Richard's new website for that at this point, but it's still there. It's on the web. It's a great resource. And I know because I've looked at the logs over time and seen the volume, it's been downloaded off of our website over 6 million times. So it's it's the reason why Google puts it to the top of the list when you search for that. Great resource. Teams around the world are using it. And it is, I like what Richard called it. He called it a keystone habit for teams to recognize how to split user stories. If you don't have that habit, it's very difficult to be successful. But when you have that habit and skill, it's a lot easier to be successful. The game of Tetris, I try to use all the time when I'm talking about sprint planning. Would you rather have these big giant blocks coming down trying to fill the bottom, or do you like that when the single block comes down? The same thing is true for your sprint. Do you want these big chunks you're trying to fit into a sprint, or these little tiny chunks that fit in easily? So the smaller you can make it, the more often you'll finish your sprint successfully. And even if you don't finish the sprint successfully, you missed a couple of really small things rather than this gigantic thing. So it's always helpful to make those smaller chunks. And I'll go back to something Peter says all the time. When do you want to know you're wrong? I'd rather be working on small chunks and find out I'm wrong than working on a big thing and find out at the end that I was wrong. So small chunks come into play a lot. It helps you not avoid the carryover. And so carrying over from one sprint to the next and knowing it ahead of time, total BS in our view. So Peter, why don't you wrap us up?
You got it, my friend. I think it's all has been said from our two sides here. But again, we're just two men who've been in the game for a while, and we have strong opinions, sometimes weakly held. So if you have alternative ideas, feel free to check us out on agileforall.com. You can join our forums and our community, which is growing, as well as you can find us on Twitter. Obviously, subscribe, smash the like button to this YouTube, and we'll see you guys in the next one.